Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Kristina Woolston, and if you're in Alaska, it's the morning. If you're in other time zones, it's probably a little bit later. We have a couple panelists joining us on the East Coast. I'm here today to lead a virtual discussion from the Nature Conservancy in Alaska on the topic of Indigenous leadership on climate change. And we're thrilled to have a astounding and esteemed panel today. I'm going to introduce them in just a moment here. The Alaska Climate Opportunities Assessment Series hosted by the Nature Conservancy is a new effort that's been undertaken this summer. The Alaska Climate Opportunities Assessment is used to inform and educate Alaskans on the merits of bipartisan climate solutions. We have some government representatives here on the panel today. We have Alaska Native Corporation. We have former government leaders on the panel today. So I think a broad discussion is going to be had. The Nature Conservancy has partnered with McKinley Research Group to commission a research on Alaska's unique opportunities in addressing climate change and assessing the economic implications of recent, current, and future implications of investments or policies. And so that's why public-private engagement is so important to us, and we appreciate TNC for hosting. In today's discussion, we'll explore the efforts and perspectives of Alaska Native leaders from across our state. And we'll also look at their opportunities stemming from work on climate-related initiatives and the initial findings from the Alaska Climate Opportunities Assessment. And there are really two components to that opportunities assessment. They're looking at resilient homes, Alaskan building for climate change, as well as Alaska's renewable energy economy. So some really great discussion points on that as well. During the discussion today, please utilize the Q&A button on the bottom right-hand side of your screen. And we will start the panel. I'll give a brief introduction of myself, and then I'll call on each of the panelists to give an introduction of themselves, and then we'll get going with the discussion. So I'm Kristina Woolston. I'm the External Affairs Manager with Donlin Gold. Donlin Gold is developing a large gold deposit in partnership with Chulista Native Corporation and the Kuskokwim Corporation, which are the landowners in Western Alaska, a project that has been under development for nearly 27 years. So a long time to look at the opportunities and to do it right in a sustainable way. I'm originally from the community of Naknek and Bristol Bay, and I'm a Bristol Bay Native Corporation shareholder, Pavik Village Corporation shareholder, and Naknek Native Village Corporation, Naknek Native Village Tribal Council member. And I had the opportunity to work with everybody on this panel as we look at Alaska Native lands and resource development issues and tribal issues over the years. So welcome, everyone. I'm going to turn the microphone over to Sheri Buretta, who will give a brief introduction. Sheri is the chair of the Chugach Alaska Corporation and the interim board CEO. She's also a director of the Tititla Corporation and chair of the University of Alaska Board of Regents, which we thank you for your leadership in all of those roles, Sheri.
Thank you, Kristina, and thank you for moderating this great panel. I'm really excited about the conversations that we'll be having today. At Chugach, we've done a lot of work to look at our lands in a meaningful way and balance our responsibility for preservation and ownership of that land for the next generations to come. And by working with organizations such as the Nature Conservancy and others, it makes sense to really have this discussion about the future and the climate changes that are happening to our rural communities and to all of us as human beings on this planet. And so I really appreciate the work that AFN has done. I've served on that board for about 23 years, and I'm also on the ANCSA Regional Association board, and they do a lot of great work focusing on the collective ownership of Alaska Native regional corporations. And so I'm looking forward to this conversation, and thank you for the opportunity to introduce myself and participate.
I'm muting myself. There's some planes flying over. I'd like to introduce now Anthony Mallott, who is the president and CEO of Sealaska Corporation. Anthony, if you could give a brief introduction of your background of Sealaska and what you see as some of the critical issues that you're facing related to the topic today.
Yes, thank you. Good to be here. Again, I'm Anthony Mallott. My Tlingit name is Chugach. I'm originally from Yakutat, Alaska, which is the nice sandy beaches you see behind me in my screen. But I'm also a grandchild of the Koyukon Athabascan. My mother grew up in Rampart on the Yukon River. Sealaska is the regional corporation that represents 23,000 Tlingit, Haida, and Tsimshian shareholders, all from communities in Southeast, stretching from Heidelberg in the south to Yakutat in the north. And every single one of our communities cares about climate change. They care about the health of our oceans. They care about the management of the priority subsistence species. They care about the management of every species. And so, knowing that our communities and our people have a significant care and want to be a part of the management structure and the decision making, we've put a lot of our business focus onto aligning our businesses with our communities and with our people, and we'll kind of be highlighting some of the avenues that we've taken to take that step.
Thank you, Anthony. I'm going to go now to Amber Ebarb, who is Deputy Staff Director, U.S. Senate Committee on Indian Affairs, under Vice Chairman Senator Lisa Murkowski from Alaska. So welcome, Amber.
Thank you, Kristina. I'm very happy to be here with the fellow panelists here with truly some leadership for the state of Alaska and nationally with Tara on the panel. My name is Amber Ebarb. I'm Tlingit. My Tlingit name is Jendukla. I'm Tlinadi, a member of the Raven Dog Salmon Clan. My mom and grandparents are from Puna, Alaska, and I'm a child of the Wishkitan, the Eagle Shark Clan. I started in the committee for Senator Murkowski earlier this year when she took over as vice chairman on the Indian Affairs Committee. She served on this committee her entire time in the Senate, showing just the prioritization she places on Alaska Native issues and concerns. Before coming to the committee, I was the legislative assistant for Senator Murkowski in our personal office, handling Alaska Native and rural affairs. There, I worked on a number of legislative priorities for the senator, including missing and murdered Indigenous women, bills to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic, addressing rural public safety, some land transfer legislation, and housing. Earlier this year, the committee held a roundtable on climate issues. And we also, in the Senate, Senator Murkowski has been very involved in negotiating some key pieces of legislation that I think would be relevant to the panel today and the topic. So I'll talk later about some of the infrastructure opportunities and ways that we can collaborate and work together. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Amber. That's great. We're happy to have you here from the public sector. Tara Sweeney, Principal and CEO, Tax 71, former Assistant Secretary of Indian Affairs, former Senior Vice President of External Affairs for Arctic Slope Regional Corporation. Thank you, Tara, for participating today. So we'd love to hear in terms of your background and perspective on the topic at hand and how can we all work together to address.
Thank you. And I'm really excited to be here. As Kristina said, had a brief stint in the public sector as Assistant Secretary for Indian Affairs and recently moved back home to Alaska in January. I am from the Arctic Slope region. Utpervik is my hometown. I'm also an enrolled member with the Native Village of Barrow and Inuit community of the Arctic Slope. And currently you will find me residing in Girdwood.
Great. Thank you, Tara. So we also have Ben Mallott, who is Vice President at the Alaska Federation of Natives. Can you tell us a little bit about who AFN is, what your role is, and why this topic is so important to AFN?
Thank you, and thank you for having me here today. I don't have such a cool background as my brother Anthony. My name is Ben. I'm Vice President AFN. My father's from Yakutat, mother's from Rampart. I have the honor of serving as Vice President AFN. AFN is Alaska's largest Native nonprofit. Our membership includes 169 federally recognized tribes, 166 Alaska Native Village corporations, 9 regional corporations, and 12 regional nonprofits. So one of the main duties of AFN is to enhance and promote the cultural, economic, and political voice of the Alaska Native community. That means making sure our members are at the table at all times, especially when it comes to climate change mitigation and policy. Pretty much one of our former AFN co-chairs, Albert, says not at the table, you're on the table. And so one of AFN's main jobs is to keep our members at the table. With that said, I'm happy to be here. Sheri's AFN board director, and also it's great to see Tara. Tara's a former AFN co-chair, and I really do miss working with her. So with that said, that's all I have to say. Thanks.
Thank you, Ben. So to kick off the conversation, and again, if folks would like to send in questions, use the Q&A button on the bottom right-hand side of your screen. When we look at regional opportunities to share renewable resources and working together, tribes and Alaska Native corporations, our communities are so unique, and they're also pretty spread apart. You have represented today the Arctic Slope, South Central with Chugach Corporation, of course, Sealaska Corporation. I'm originally from the Bristol Bay area. When we look at resources for each community and how we can address some of the challenges that are subsets of the climate solutions, what are ways that tribes and Alaska Native corporations, looking at our history and our relationships, can work together to address some of these solutions? And I'm going to, Sheri, I'm going to ask you to kick it off. And then I think it'll just hopefully, I'll ask each of you to just jump in and to offer your thoughts as we address this first question.
Thank you, Kristina. Excellent question and timely as we look at the fact that the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act is in its 50th year since inception this year. AFN is focusing on that as their convention theme. The convention's been postponed this year to December because of COVID. The question about how we're working with our communities is important this year because of the of COVID and the CARES Act funding and the Chehalis lawsuit that took place. Our communities really started working more closely together. And so, in crisis, I think people come together, and that's our history with our Native people. The group is more important than the individual, and that's how we've survived for tens of thousands of years in this harsh climate. And it's no different today. Although we have a lot of technological capacity, I mean, we actually were able to be more connected through Zoom than we normally do because of our remoteness in coming together. And so we were meeting weekly to talk about how to protect our communities, how to deal with this unprecedented situation. And we had been working on community involvement for the last 5 years and getting our communities engaged in what we're doing with our lands within the region and how we can ensure that these small rural communities are there in the future. The challenges that they're dealing with on an every day is overwhelming sometimes. And our communities are very small, and the leadership a lot of times are doing so many different things that they get overwhelmed. And so what we're trying to do is fill in gaps of need. And as we look at this lawsuit that was filed questioning the really the structure of Alaska Native corporations, it makes us all have to open our eyes to the precious situation that we have, not only with our people and our land and our communities, but our history. The threat of us being here in the future is real. And so, you know, the climate is one thing, but all the other effects are even greater. So we're really putting a lot of effort on our ability to use our position because of our land, because of the Settlement Act, to work with our tribes to strengthen them, to ensure that they are strong and healthy and protected, and are dealing with the climate changes impact on their way of life because of the fact that many of our communities don't have stores. The ocean is their store, and that's how they've survived for thousands of years. And so it's critically important that we focus on this. But it's also about balance. If you think about 50 years ago, the reason why the Settlement Act happened was because of the discovery of oil and the nation's need for getting to that oil. And so settling the native land claims was critical to that. And so as we start talking about shifting from fossil fuels to renewable energy and other ways to impact the what's happening to our environment, we have to look at balance, because you can't just change a economic structure overnight. You have to look at ways that you continue to benefit the economy, which has been the bloodline for Alaska. And so we have a lot of really dynamic challenges that we're dealing with, but I am convinced that we are ready to deal with them and work together to solve these challenges moving forward. Thank you, Kristina.
Thank you, Sheri. I appreciate that. Anthony, from your perspective, how is Sealaska working with tribes and Alaska Native Corporation and your communities to address some of the challenges? And then I'll come back if you guys want to talk about specific projects, that would be great. I know, Sheri, you guys had worked on a carbon credit program a while back, and certainly you have a lot of resources on your lands. And so kind of the first conversation about, you know, specifically tribes and our villages and our village and regional corporations working together.
Yeah, thank you. I think the fact that Sheri, what Sheri just said, I could repeat, and it would be Sealaska's perspective, and it would be our community, shows us that we're all in the same boat. And because of that, we work together. We work together at AFN, we work together at the ANCSA regional associations, through tribal networks, within our own regional networks, because again, we have that same story. And I really appreciate Sheri's note of, you know, everybody wants to address climate change, but it's really nice to see out of the Biden administration, at least the talking points, at least, you know, the priorities within the executive orders that have come out also include the focus on inclusive growth, which every single one of our Native communities requires. We've lost access to commercial fisheries. Tourism has not benefited our communities. Natural resource extraction is still there, but is tenuous. So a focus on inclusive growth at the same time that we're addressing climate change needs to be there, because the other priorities include social justice and the focus on tribal communities. And because they're coming out of the Biden administration, I'm repeating back those mantras with every entity and agency that we work with, because if they follow those mantras, they're going to end up smack dab in our traditional Native communities working to achieve those priorities. And for us, that includes everything from supporting our Sitka tribe of Alaska in a herring lawsuit in terms of management of a very, very critical resource for us, a spiritual resource that the Tlingits have been collecting for millennia, and it's at risk, not only because of climate change, but because of management. So that management has a big part to play. AFN is playing within that. AFN putting priorities within the Magnuson-Stevens authorization around tribal seats at the management bodies, a refocus on subsistence. That's another avenue that we are fully behind supporting, and highlights, Native entities working together to get our priorities known. Worked with Cake. Cake got sued by the state of Alaska for a federal hunt, emergency hunt during COVID. We're supporting Cake in the tribe there in their lawsuit that they won and is now being challenged. And we're supporting our tribes in their want to pursue co-management. And in Southeast, that looks like an Indigenous Guardians network. That includes Indigenous stewardship and the want to have our own people doing scientific monitoring. At the research table with NOAA, with the Forest Service, with the Fish and Wildlife Service, with the Park Services. And when all those agencies align behind the concept of Indigenous stewardship and adding Indigenous stewardship into their own work, I think what you'll get is positive economic outcomes for our communities and positive environmental outcomes that everybody wants at the same time. And so really pushing that concept, and would just highlight that the Canadian government just put $350 million behind Indigenous Guardians and Indigenous stewardship efforts. And we're highlighting that wherever we can within our own government, because we think that's the level of priority that our own Indigenous knowledge is worth, and more in regard to creating the environmental outcomes we're seeking.
Great, thank you. So Tara, I'm going to go to you to talk a little bit about some of your thoughts on the, how does our Indigenous leadership and experience form where we are today from your perspective, private and public sector, and the conversations that you had, not just with Alaska's Indigenous people, but lower 48 tribes and Native Hawaiian organizations. This is not a topic that's unique to Alaska. Obviously, it's a global issue and a global topic. And the perspective of Indigenous leadership on climate is so relevant right now. At any point in time, it just seems like this is such the pinnacle of the conversation. What is your perspective on ways that our communities can work together and inform each other?
Well, thank you, Kristina. And I just want to thank the Nature Conservancy for bringing this panel together. I certainly support the messages coming out of the Chugach region and the Sealaska region. And again, to underscore Anthony's point that, there is agreement with these types of approaches. And it really is about leveraging resources, whether it's in the tribal community, working with the ANC community, or vice versa, leveraging those resources and working together. Despite the complicated governance fabric that we have in Alaska and the different constituencies or structures the same constituencies have throughout each region. One thing that I would like to point out is that as Alaska Natives, the only constant that we know is a changing environment. And as Alaska Natives, just as we have in the past, we continue to adapt. And so one of the key takeaways or top line messages that I continue to support is that we're not victims of climate change. And you've heard earlier that our people have survived millennia due to the fact that we are resilient and have adapted in the face of constant natural and even human threats. So it's important for those that are participating in this discussion to remember that the policy discussions shouldn't be necessarily driven by savior victim relationship, but rather a discussion about empowerment and sustainability. And when you listen to the conversations that take place, we are constantly promoting the narrative to outsiders that Alaska is unique and that a cookie cutter approach doesn't work for us. And that narrative really rings true in the discussions on climate change and climate opportunities. As we look across Native American communities throughout the United States and even in our neighboring sister country, Canada, there's room to consider a more holistic approach that does cultivate in an environment where there are innovative solutions and relative initiatives are vetted. And that was one of the requirements or what was communicated to us as panelists in terms of the types of comments that we should consider providing today. And so one of the areas that I would challenge all of us to look to work through, and the lens to look through, is one of ecological sustainability, where climate change is one component. I have a former colleague of mine named Scott Cameron, who recently published an article in the Irrigation Leader magazine, of all magazines, but there he laid out a theory that truly resonated with me and my Alaska values. And climate change was one of the pillars. There are other dimensions or other pillars and that he talks about: controlling invasive species, managing the range and forest lands, and industrial food production. And he argues that temperature change alone, addressing the temperature change alone, will not achieve ecological sustainability. And so when I read that, it really sparked my curiosity, and I began to see merit in his argument, because from my perspective and the way that I grew up, the ecological sustainability approach is so aligned with the Alaskan way, and it mirrors the strong characteristics of how leadership from my home region approached complex historical issues like the introduction of oil and gas development that Sheri mentioned. He recently also expounded upon those points, and he published, they were recently published in the Federal News Network. And Amber, there are some really great recommendations in there with respect to the Department of the Interior, which may interest you in your current capacity. But, that approach really got me thinking, what is, aside from the obvious warming effects, what is the underlying driver for climate change? It's security. It's personal security, natural environment security, and food security. So whether you call it ecological sustainability or ecological security, it's an approach that may bring parties together who currently find themselves at opposite ends of the debate spectrum. And so as we consider leveraging resources or working across different Indigenous communities or within our own fabric in Alaska, taking that holistic approach to support the points that have been raised by Sheri and by Anthony is really kind of the Alaskan way, because a cookie cutter approach does not work for anything we do in this state. Thank you.
Thanks, Tara. I think it's a really great introduction to a question to Amber from your perspective. We just had, we've had so much resources coming out of the government the last couple of years for both COVID, CARES Act. But we recently saw the infrastructure package, of which Senator Murkowski helped to draft, or really predominantly drafted. And I'm wondering, can you discuss some of the wins from that landmark legislation that can have an impact on this discussion, and how we can, it's just such a great example of a bipartisan approach. Would you mind talking about that for a little bit?
Absolutely, and thanks for the calling out of the bipartisan approach there. I think if we're going to make progress here on resiliency or addressing some of the challenges related to climate changes, it will have to take a bipartisan effort. So I was really happy to help the senator in making sure that Alaska's needs and Native communities' needs were addressed on an equitable basis here. I was listening to the other speakers. I think sustainability is a really important concept here. Any efforts to address climate change, I think, going forward need to be compatible with Alaska Native food security, energy security, economic security, culture, and public health. And so bringing that back to the bipartisan infrastructure package, we had a lot of disparities that were highlighted due to COVID-19 and the pandemic. It really underscored some of the disparities in infrastructure and public health and governmental services. We always talk about, and Sheri and Tara and Anthony have mentioned the unique structure of tribes and ANCs in Alaska, how INCSA has created a different landscape. We have different service delivery models. Many of them are very effective under self-governance and the Indian Self-Determination Act, but there are other ways that, just due to our location and remoteness, we have to do a lot of catch up when it comes to broadband and water and sewer infrastructure. There are ways that these were highlighted, as I mentioned, during the pandemic. So including enough funding in the bipartisan infrastructure package to clear the entire backlog of the IHS sanitation facilities need will certainly go a long way in promoting sustainability. This is also related to public health and so many other issues that are related to just needing clean water. There are also other resources included under the Safe Drinking Water Act and Clean Water Act, up to $11 billion over 10 years. And then there were other areas where the senator made sure to make Alaska tribes and ANCs eligible using the Indian Self-Determination Act definition under the energy title. There are many programs in there around cleanup of contaminated sites and plugging orphan wells. And then additionally, some funding in there in the Bureau of Indian Affairs for tribal climate resilience and community relocation efforts. It's not enough to address all of the need, which is really large, that we all know, billions and billions of dollars, but at least it's a start to addressing some of those sides of things. But to Tara's point and Sheri's, we can see how responsible natural resource production can take on a balanced approach that reduces environmental impact. But it's really important to recognize the important economic benefits for Alaska Native communities and the state as a whole. Coming back to economic security, there's if the bipartisan infrastructure package passes through the House, hopefully it will. I think there's going to be a tremendous need for coordination among the public sector and ANCs and tribes, the state, local governments. We saw some of the success with some of the CARES Act funding and some of the COVID-19, the bipartisan bill at the end of last year, with the $1 billion that was included for the tribal broadband connectivity grants. And some of the rental assistance, some of the programs where the tribes and local governments work together to get these resources out. I think we are very aware of the litigation in Chehalis and the ANCSA ANCs attempted to be excluded by some of the tribes in the lower 48. But at the same time, we do have a lot of models of success here, notwithstanding the lack of understanding of outsiders about how things work up here. So I would just, as we look at the potential infusion of resources for what can really make communities in Alaska and especially rural Alaska sustainable, including some of these environmental programs, in addition to building up infrastructure, I would just encourage us all to think about coordination and then ways that this can lay the groundwork for future growth and economic opportunity into the future. But that's just, it's not very specific to climate change, but I think just touching back on sustainability, I wanted to raise that and the opportunity that is in front of us now.
Ben, will you talk a little bit about AFN in terms of, again, your approach to bringing a myriad of resources together in leadership and the needs and what you guys see as an approach to address so many of this across our state?
Yeah, thank you. And I just want to, echo a lot what Tara said. It's great to have her here. And, she kind of said a couple of things, Savior, Alaska is unique. Alaska is a very unique state. And actually, that's the same for any Indigenous community across the world, Hawaii, Canada, South America. And part of what AFN and how we deal with, climate change mitigation and policy is that Tara's right. Our climate has always changed. But for Alaskan Natives, and especially Indigenous peoples around the world, so is our policy, right? Alaskan Natives, an Indigenous person in the world is affected by policy 10 times more than any other person, right? We have policies on our health, policies on our public safety, policies on our housing. And so one of the jobs at AFN is to make sure that our Native organization has the capacity to deal with those changes, not only in policy, but in climate change as well. So, if you look at, decades old environmental movements, such as the creation of park services and natural refuge lands, that has pitted Native, traditional hunting grounds against our communities, right? It blocks those off to what our people or communities have always traditionally hunted or viewed as their relationship, right? With us Native people, we look at the land, water, and sea as our relationship with those, right? They interact with our culture, land, and language. So part of AFN, when we look at raise our capacity, is also looking at co-management. Tara talked about it, Anthony's talked about it, Sheri's talked about it, is how do we increase our capacity as Native peoples to address and mitigate climate change and the policy realm. And so having Native peoples have a seat at the table through management. If you look at Tara's region, Uktiavik, with with the waiting commissions, they do a great job managing that resource. Look at Nunavut in Canada. Nunavut has an awesome co-management structure where the policy of how the communities hunt and harvest the land starts at the local level and builds its way up. So actually the government has to interact if they don't agree with the community, right? So one of the reasons why AFN is doing this is how we increase capacity at local level. Just working with our regionals, working with our tribes, working with nonprofits, because Alaska is unique, right? Alaska, we have very small communities, and we also have very large, capacity at the regional level. And that's kind of one of the reasons why AFN and how AFN works is to kind of raise our capacity and our voices, through great co-management, expanding cooperative management to full co-management, and also, using those models we have today and kind of expanding those to other regions.
So when we look at Tara, I love the way that you talked about the security component, and it really comes down to how our basic needs being met in so many of our communities. We would love to advance some of the more progressive renewable energy options in our communities, but there are some basic needs that have yet to be met. And when we look at, for example, in Bristol Bay, we looked at geothermal for a long time and spent quite a bit of money there and weren't able to cross the finish line with that. It's become a bit of a stranded project. And we look at other infrastructure that can help us advance into more renewable energy or infrastructure that can, address some of the carbon footprint. And part of the challenge that we have is not just the investment in the infrastructure, but the long-term maintenance and training, and how do our communities sustain those pieces of infrastructure that will lead us to a more sustainable community. From an environmental standpoint, from an energy standpoint. The Chugach community in Western Alaska is a great example. Their entire water supply was damaged in a fire this year, and community, homes don't have reliable water or sewer. So this is kind of a two-part question here that I would like the folks to address in terms of, the infrastructure package is going to address so much of the need. The need is so great, it cannot be met with just 1 year's funding and 1 year's approach. But the layering of the build out the infrastructure and then the training and then the long-term maintenance and care, because a lot of times that's not built into the public component of helping our communities. So would love to hear a little bit about your perspective. And Amber, I'm going to let you start because you're really on the ground right now in terms of how this legislation can impact our communities.
Yeah, it's a good question. And it's something that we've been pondering as we have been working on the infrastructure package. It's something that has come up in numerous hearings when we invited witnesses from Alaska and across the nation to talk about water infrastructure and broadband infrastructure, mostly water. I think you can build it, and the IHS and the Alaska Native Tribal Health Consortium help do that. There are different funding streams that are involved. Sometimes it's a little bit complicated tracking all of them, but making sure that Alaska's tribes get an equitable share here to address the disparities, was the primary concern. And then the follow-on question is for operations and maintenance and operator training and building the capacity at the local level to ensure that the infrastructure that's built can be maintained and sustained. So that's something that will be considered probably in appropriations process cycles in the future. There were some things that could be included and some things that couldn't be. There's also a portion for, administrative costs. And so that will also, be important for the implementation. It is over 10 years. So depending on the program, so it's not all just an infusion at once. It'll take a while to do this. And I know that many communities are looking at the size of even the bipartisan infrastructure package, which is a pared down hard infrastructure bill, as opposed to the reconciliation that's happening now, more than $3 trillion. Even the pared down bill, looking at what's included, I've heard some questions about, can we get this out the door? Can we put it to good use? And obviously we want it to be successful to address these ongoing inequities that are really, really basic needs. I think if anyone on the panel who has ideas about ways to ensure that the coordination and getting the dollars out the door can be made more efficient or successful, we're always looking for those ideas, whether it's waiving some sort of match requirement or if there are certain technical things that will come up, especially around broadband. And I know that the applications were just due earlier the first of the month. So these are massive programs that are being stood up, and we want to make sure that it's successful and sustainable. But those are just two programs. There are many others that we're trying to get out of the Congress successfully on a bipartisan basis. But I think that it's a really good down payment for addressing many of these needs.
Anthony, what is your what's your perspective on the question?
Yeah, all the dollars, we're thinking of them as kind of once in a generation, if not once in a lifetime for our tribal communities. And the opportunity to take the ARP funding that our tribes already have, build the capacity where it's missing, find more grant writers, find facilitators and coordinators, go get every last dollar that's available. Broadband is so critical. That's what we're working on first and foremost. There's Southeast consortiums of tribes and village corps and ANCs working together to enhance a critical resource that was highlighted during COVID. Ties to education, ties to healthcare, ties to safety and security. But then you also have everything else that was brought up. And so I'll highlight the Sustainable Southeast Partnership Network again, because Tlingit and Haida and Sealaska are both partners within that network. And we're going to stand up a co-managed position. So co-funded by Sealaska and Tlingit and Haida. And that position will sit within Tlingit and Haida to help our tribes coordinate and facilitate those dollars to the maximum community benefit in Southeast Alaska. And so we know what good projects look like. And if we coordinate, we can put good social projects in place, rehab centers, assisted living that is needed. We can put economic development projects in place, cultural tourism, infrastructure, a focus on the recreation economy that could benefit some of our rural Southeast communities. And also all the time pushing for the co-management concept that has been covered so significantly to date. And I'll take that opportunity to shame myself for not thanking TNC before this. The Nature Conservancy has been one of the strongest partnerships of any non-native organization Sealaska has ever worked with. They are at the table. They know our communities. They share our values. They've dove in to understand what Indigenous stewardship means, and they're committed to it. And they're just fantastic to work with. And when we started by highlighting, the uniqueness of Sealaska showing up in Senator Murkowski's office side by side our tribe and asking for the same things. Sealaska working with Konyag on community fisheries access. It's also very unique when Sealaska shows up to the USDA or again into Senator Sullivan's office and the Nature Conservancy is side by side us. It's a different picture, and we want that to be noticed, that we're expanding our partnerships because we're finding people that care about the same things. It's not just the environmental outcomes, it's the positive community outcomes that we all want as well.
Yeah, the shared values certainly is across all of our organizations, which I think is represented by the panel and by the host organization today, the Nature Conservancy. So couldn't agree more. It's a wonderful, unique conversation. Tara, would you like to address some of the needs yet unmet in the communities from an infrastructure standpoint? How do we address those long-term, the variety of organizations and funding that are out there right now? Some of the documents specifically talk about training and the opportunity to create jobs that are perhaps not in the traditional sector of what we see in communities. And then how do we start to use these funding for long-term benefit and bring the public and the private sector and the nonprofit sector together for solutions?
Thank you. You know, there are a couple of components here, and it goes back to just leveraging resources and doing it in a very strategic manner. Working with, you know, if you're a corporation, working with your tribe and municipality to form an intra-regional coalition to pursue federal funding opportunities in a very deliberate manner based on your priorities. It also requires members of Congress to hold these departments and agencies accountable for their lack of understanding of the fabric of Alaska Native governance in an Alaska Native community. So when you look at an independent agency like the FCC, and they are punitive towards Alaska Native corporations in applying for funding for broadband infrastructure, when in fact they are the landowner, that does no one or does everyone a disservice. The nice, and I would say the productive thing that came out from that approach, although it is very inefficient, is that it brought together tribes and corporations. However, it's important that agencies understand the fabric of the governance structure in Alaska, in our communities, so that when more funding becomes available down the road, it's not inefficient or backwards. And in this case, in my opinion, what happened with the 2.5 gigahertz spectrum offering, it was a little backwards, despite all of the advocacy that Alaska Native organizations, tribal and corporate entities engaged in at the federal level. And then the other component would be to financial institutions, where many financial institutions have made blanket statements that they were no longer going to engage in project financing if there were energy projects in the Arctic. Alaska is the Arctic. It is by definition an Arctic state, and the entire state is considered the Arctic. And so those types of statements have punitive damages on our communities. So if really the bottom line is, if there is a genuine interest in promoting Arctic economic growth or Alaska economic growth, economic security, livelihood, then an all of the above approach, again, is important when considering investment opportunities. And as Congress continues to deliberate on funding mechanisms or funding opportunities for Alaska Native communities, in addition to holding the agencies or departments accountable for their understanding of Alaska, I do believe that Congress also has a responsibility to our state to attract in the most effective manner those private dollars, and to ensure that the financial industry is not adversely impacting the livelihoods of people in Tuntatuliak or in Anaktuvuk Pass or in Cake, simply to satisfy a shareholder base that has no idea what it's like to live in the most extreme and remote areas of North America.
Thank you, Tara. We have a couple of questions on the Q&A chat line, and one of them is from Adelheid Herman. It goes along with your comments, Tara. Amber, it talks about the government agencies and coordination, and I think that this is a great question about our communities, our tribes, trying to access funds and opportunities. I know, for example, this last year, Donlin Gold sponsored and supported legal support based out of Bethel for tribes and small businesses to apply, because it was such a complex, timely, such a tight window turnaround. A lot of the times we're so far behind the 8 ball, getting the information, being able to access the information. Broadband will help, because I remember back in the day when people would fly a thumb drive into a community so that they could send their application for funding. So all of these things layer in the challenges for us to even meet the requirements to get public funding. So again, Adelaide Herman, thanks for your question about how do we coordinate. I think some of the great examples of the way that the Alaska Native corporations are working with the tribal entities to apply is so, it's so encouraging. We're seeing that with broadband applications right now. But Amber, what are other ways that we can accelerate and enhance our ability to meet some of the requirements for this public funding?
Yeah, it's a good question, because each of the agencies that have received new funding for new programs, including NTIA or FCC or Commerce, each of those things, and I should mention the numerous COVID relief bills. There have been about 5 of them, including the CARES Act. Originally, there was money for addressing the struggling fisheries in what was considered Indian country, and there was a small amount that was going to go to Alaska and tribes, one tribe, but the mismatch of sometimes Congress's understanding of Alaska and our needs becomes apparent. So within the CARES Act, Senator Murkowski, as an example, helped secure fisheries disaster relief funding, which will be critical in helping the fishing industry stay afloat. But so it was allocated in 2020, but it's taking much too long to reach the communities. So sometimes we have to come back after the fact and try to address the delay in the way an agency is implementing the program. So the senator is working to advance a bill with Senator Wicker, which would shorten the timeline for that funding to be received. And then it would also expand the requirements on who is eligible to declare a disaster to include tribes. So as it stands, fisheries should start receiving CARES Act fisheries funding as soon as the end of September or early October. But I'm just raising it because this is such a major issue in Alaska right now, with some of the collapse of the salmon runs in the Yukon and other areas. And whether it's related to climate change or what the cause is, it's something that needs to be addressed. And so we're hearing a lot more about that. But so there's that agency problem that sometimes we have to hear from constituents, or you can always reach out if you're seeing an agency do a poor job in implementation. But there's also, I've seen a lot of efficiency in the way that the tribes and the ANCs and the villages have been working together under the Indian Self-Determination Act and putting together regional applications. You mentioned broadband. This is a possibility in a lot of different agencies. The Self-Determination Act and self-governance in general are really useful mechanisms. So some of the smaller villages that don't have the grant writers can reach out to their consortia and work together and then build those economies of scale. That's something that has led to the success in the healthcare arena. It would be good to see that sort of partnership at the whether tribal, ANC, village, and other agencies as well. So you mentioned broadband as an example of that. I think that's good. It's just one thing that can be a useful tool to use as you look at these programs. And then hopefully that capacity that gets built can be leveraged for applications to other agencies, whether that's USDA or DOE. A lot of agencies will be rolling out significant programs pretty soon. But I know capacity is always the question about whether the neediest communities will be able to access those. So those are just a couple thoughts.
So one of the projects that Donlin Gold has supported this last year, the local village corporation cooperative, the Kuskokwim Corporation, started a nonprofit entity called Fish Wheel. And they're working on a biomass project locally, which needs a lot of funding to get off of the ground. So we've partnered with them. The state has partnered with some grant money. There's probably some federal money they can go after, but it's the same concept, right? Of bringing these consortia together. And it is oftentimes public, private, nonprofit, Native corporation, healthcare corporation coming together. We're seeing some really creative partnerships. Sheri, can you talk a little bit about some of the partnerships, in specific opportunities? I think you had the ways that Chugach has worked with its tribes over the years, and maybe other for-profit entities on opportunities for community benefit.
Sure, Kristina, I'd be happy to. And like Anthony, I want to thank the Nature Conservancy. We've had some great projects with them, including our coal, retiring coal rights out in the Bering River coal field that we own the subsurface and the surface to, and the carbon projects. And they have been very beneficial to our community and our people. With regards to the question, Chugach adopted a 100-year plan for generational prosperity for our people, knowing full well that that's our responsibility to the next generations. And so the decisions that we make today in regards to protection of our lands and continued ownership is critical. So looking at a bigger picture. And so as we start to develop that and looking back at our history, our mission is profitability, ownership of our lands, and celebration of our heritage. And, we almost lost all of that in 1991 during a bankruptcy that happened 2 years after the Exxon Valdez oil spill spilt 11 million gallons of crude 3 miles from the village where my mom was born in Tititlik. And that incident continues to devastate our people and our corporation because of the split estate that exists with purchase of the surface estate, of which Chugach still retains ownership of the subsurface on conservation, and they were put into conservation. So it's a conflict that we're trying to resolve through current legislation. But the impact that the bankruptcy had on our spirit was devastating. And had it not been for the Small Business Administration 8A program, which was the missing link of the Settlement Act that built capacity for our corporation to be able to have profitability, to be able to do the things that ANCSA lays out for our social and economic mandate. And so as we have built that capacity, we've been able to look at our lands in a different way, whether it's conservation, whether it's development, whether it's opportunities for employment, and how we coexist with our tribes. And it's a different model than the lower 48 reservation system. And this lawsuit that we just were successful in fighting off really shines a spotlight on that. And so the fact that the tribal system of the reservation system has profit-making arms that may be in government contracting or tribal casinos, or however they're bringing in economic opportunities for their people and their communities, it's different. And so as we are being more aware of the need for our tribes to be able to be sustainable, the technical capacity to be able to write grants, administer grants, and put these projects into place becomes even more critical. And so by us partnering with our business acumen and our ownership of lands and our care about the social and economic well-being of our people, that is in essence what we're mandated to do. And so as we evolve, as we learn, as we are able to be competitive in the global marketplace and bring those profits back to Alaska and back to our people and our communities, ensuring that we do it in a balanced way where our people and our lands are at the forefront are critical to that. So those relationships that we are building and that we are identifying are critical to that success. So I can just say that we're on a daily basis focusing on that, and it's exciting. It's an exciting point in time to be able to have this vision of intergenerational prosperity for our people for the next 100 years.
You know, Sheri, you talked about the 8A program, and I'd like to brag a little bit on the Akiak tribe in the Kuskokwim region, Chilista, Yukon-Kuskokwim region. They're the first tribe in Alaska to have an 8A subsidiary, and they're focused on telecom and bringing telecom capabilities to their community, taking advantage of some of the opportunities. So I think that's it's a great way that the village corporation as well as the tribe kind of come together to create this tribal 8A entity subsidiary to go after some of the opportunities. And part of the whole topic of this series is Alaska climate opportunities. And there are lots of ways that, you know, as we look at Alaska, it's all one big opportunity right now, right? To meet the need and to address some of the challenges that we have. Tara, can you talk a little bit about some of the successes that communities have had in the North Slope, and actually really from a broader tribal sense of looking at ways to address need locally in their communities, whether it's energy or water, sewer, other ways to be innovative that may translate into other Alaska communities?
Thank you. You know, with the work that we were doing in the Department of the Interior at Indian Affairs, there was a strong push and focus on providing capacity for grant writing and building an infrastructure that was currently not there. And we were working on building that infrastructure to provide grant writing capacity for tribal entities. And so looking at ways, and perhaps, you know, again, with Senator Murkowski so strategically positioned on the Indian Affairs Committee and the Interior Appropriations Committee, you know, there's opportunities there to build into the Indian Affairs structure capacity building, like grant writers available for our tribal entities. And what we saw going in at Indian Affairs, there were a number of tribes in Alaska who were coming in to look at alternative energy approaches for their communities, whether it was through tidal, whether tidal energy, hydro, or even through wood pellets. And Indian Affairs worked within the Office of Indian Energy and Economic Development at the time to provide funding opportunities for those types of approaches. And what I saw was there was a keen interest in Alaska to provide affordable energy opportunities for even the most remote areas. And looking at how can you, again, going back to leveraging the resources within your region with all of the entities, and leveraging the federal funding that may be available to one sector of your community, but trying to stitch it all together so that there was a comprehensive approach to, let's say, affordable energy in remote communities. And there is a very prominent role for Indian Affairs to play in helping advance Alaska Native communities. I think you're on mute, Kristina.
Thank you. Great. I'm looking at some of the questions here to the audience. And let's see here. You answered one of those about grant writing support. I think that's absolutely right. Getting some capacity in the hands of folks in the communities and to support that. Let's see here. This is an interesting question. I really like this. So Ben, you talked about co-management. Anthony, you had to, I know, Amber, Tara, Sheri, this is all a conversation that we live with in terms of Indigenous lands and traditional use, as well as the need for jobs and responsibly and economically and sustainably developing our lands, because that's our cultural value as well. This was, I thought, a really unique and interesting question because being from Bristol Bay, of course, the largest salmon run in the world passes in front of the house that I was born and raised in. And we look at other areas that have salmon sustainability issues right now, and how do we understand that? But looking at the opportunities to develop our water resources, the question from Hope Roberts is, she was talking about inclusive growth of natural resource development and how does it work for extraction of water resource projects? For instance, if there were to be a kelp farm, so we know the shareholder and Alaska Native Corporation model about developing lands, but our waters that are attached to our traditional use lands, how do we approach that for the benefit of the broader community? How could you share that in a concept with the community? So I'm going to first go to Ben and ask you if there are any projects that you know of developing our water resources, and how do we share that with our communities?
That's a great question. Actually, I think that question might be better for Sheri and Anthony, since both those regions have been involved in sustainable seafoods and how to use the resources within their regions to bring that sustainable development forward. I guess kind of going back to, AFN and what we're pushing for is definitely co-management and having our communities at the table in terms of resource development and or management goes a long way in terms of, avoiding conflict. But in terms of water, development, definitely, AFN, and the work we've done, we've been very proud of what Sealaska's done with their sustainable seafood development, and also Sheri's region as well. So it's okay, like point to those two.
That's great. Why don't you kick it off, Anthony?
Yeah, thank you. And it did, the tie to kelp is right on the mark. Oyster farms have been in Southeast for a few decades at this point. They've stayed kind of a labor of love, farmers, putting in the work to make their small farm work. Tribes have been in and out and have not made a tribal project work, but we think there's room for collaboration that does allow tribal oyster farms, kelp farms, aquaculture, mariculture to have multiple species tie into policy in regard to having equal access, or maybe even prioritized access to locations around their tribal communities, and then get support from municipalities, entities like Southeast Conference, industry, to help support the growth of aquaculture and mariculture in Southeast. And so I think when you think about supporting a tribe, understanding that they should have the economic opportunity within their tribal area, it does take industry. It takes the people that know how to make mariculture and aquaculture work, committed and being at the table to support, and it takes policy and government as well. And so we're trying to piece all those pieces together to make successful projects. And in rural communities, we face so many issues: logistical costs, high energy costs. You know, we have PCE, but businesses have in Southeast pay 65-cent kilowatt hours. They don't get the benefit of PCE. So you're trying to stand up a business with high energy costs, high logistics costs, difficulty in finding employees. We have this feasibility gap framework where a tribe by themselves cannot close the feasibility gap of good economic projects. So you have to find the industry partner, you have to find the government partner, you have to find the NGO partner, the federal government, everybody to take a piece of the feasibility gap, close that gap, and then get good projects going, like mariculture and aquaculture in our communities.
Sheri, did you want to quickly give a quick example or?
Sure, it's similar to what Anthony has said. You know, the Prince William Sound has huge resources, and you know, a lot of people enjoy out there today. With the oyster farm that was out in Titlik, you know, the challenge is grants. When you have a grant for getting something like this started, once the grant runs out, if you don't have a sustainable business model that allows for profitability, then it won't succeed. And so identifying the logistical challenges that Anthony raised, you know, if you have that precious commodity, it needs to get to market quickly at a certain size. And, you know, oysters grow quickly in the Prince William Sound. And so you have to get them to market, and you have to have a workforce that's willing to go out in the wind, rain, and snow conditions to harvest those. And you can't pay them $10 an hour because they'll leave at the first chance they can get. And so, you know, having a structure where you can get people to have skin in the game and an ownership interest in working with the tribes and the communities really is the business model that I think needs to be intact in order to get people, maybe with families, to get their kids involved in understanding those, you know, the importance of hard work and you know, farming.
So I'm going to kick off a kind of a last conversation starter here. And I think this will probably, we'll have some opinions on this and some good things to share, and lead us right into the end of the talk today. We've got about 12 minutes left. But Sheri, you brought up the 50-year anniversary of the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act and how far we've come, how far we have yet to go. So the next 50 years are going to be critical for us because we've learned a lot. We've grown a lot. We've seen a lot of successes and failures. And one of the components when we look at opportunities in climate and renewables and resources in our communities is the Alaska Native traditional values of sharing. And the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, there's a base component of it called the 7I7J profit sharing model, where when you extract resources from your lands that were allotted to the regional corporation and the village corporation through ANCSA, 70% of that profit is shared with the other Native corporations and distributed through the regional level as well as the village corporation level. And it's a meaningful economic tool to share the resources amongst our Alaska Native brothers and sisters and other communities, because recognize some areas were richer in certain natural resources than others. And over the years, it has been the difference between village corporations being able to keep their lights on and to be operational. 75% of Alaska Native village corporations say that they require exclusively on those distribution payments from the resource development operators like ASRC and NANA with Red Dog and with Sealaska with Timber and others over the years, but that's on the decline. And we see in the next 8 to 10 years that those 7I7J payments will be going away. So how do we look at, from the sharing model, from our operations and our resources, from our intellectual and professional capacities, what are the next 50 years of ANCSA going to look like? And how can we meet some of the needs around climate, around energy, around education and training to sustain these wonderful projects we embark upon in our communities and in our regions? And from the partnership standpoint of the government, Amber, as our partner and facilitator in many ways for some of these exciting opportunities, how do you see partnering with our Indigenous peoples to create the facilitation in the future? So I'm going to start with Anthony, and we'll just get you kind of some of your closing thoughts, which are a little bit more, I think, comprehensive than just closing remarks. There's some real substance here.
No, there's absolutely real substance there. And I'll start by just trying to quickly go back to Sheri's concept of the 100-year plan. And Sealaska is on that same path of putting forward a 100-year vision. And we landed on the same exact spot: healthy communities and healing and wellness for our people. And when we put that forward, we knew Sealaska could not achieve that by ourselves. The ANCs just do not have that resource to provide the social infrastructure, the community infrastructure. Governments need to be involved, tribes need to be involved. And so that committed Sealaska to a collaborative approach to benefiting our people and really starting ourselves out on that healing and wellness pathway. And it goes back to our traditional values. And ASRC has committed themselves to their traditional values and really paved the way in how you instill traditional values into a business. We've done the same thing at Sealaska over the last 8 years, and have proven to ourselves first that when we utilize our traditional values in a business decision-making setting, there is tremendous value. And we want to continue to share that. And it's, some of the questions like, how do you share these collaborative models? How do you share the concept of balance for our environment, balance for our people, balance for our communities? You do it by showing that our values create success for our businesses and for our communities, and then you share them broadly. And it was briefly mentioned that the Native Hawaiians are strong partners of ours, and Alaska, the Maori from Aotearoa are strong partners of us. We have the same issues. And when we get together and discuss Indigenous values, now you're talking a global stage, the entire Pacific Ocean. And if anybody hasn't followed the Polynesian Voyaging Society, they plan to do a Pan-Pacific voyage that is focused on Indigenous communities that will start next summer based out of Juneau. And we want all of Alaska to celebrate with Southeast, welcoming our Native Hawaiian brethren, because they're going to share this shared value story across the entire Pacific. And again, when you utilize the values, the focus on balance, you not only create positive environmental outcomes, you create the community outcomes, the healing and wellness that we're all seeking towards. And when you add it to your decision making, if there's good natural resource extraction projects like Donlin that continue the 7I, we'll do those projects in a way that tie to our values as well. And we can do them in a manner that continues the success of our natural resource extraction at the same time as we focus on environmental projects as well.
Kristina, if I could go next, I'm gonna have to jump off. I've got a board meeting here in a couple minutes. I'll just say ditto to everything that Anthony just said, and take it one step farther to say that, you know, the 7I provision of sharing resources was one line in the Settlement Act. And it took years to actually develop the 7I agreement. But it has been a savior for many of our corporations, including Chugach. Had it not been for 7I, we probably would have lost our lands in the bankruptcy. So as we were growing and learning, understanding the corporate model of you know, Western civilization, it was a saving grace. And so I think through conversations like this and partners like the Nature Conservancy to host these conversations, we learn from each other, we grow, we look for opportunities to work together. And that really is what our culture is about, and making sure that we're, you know, doing the right thing for the right reasons. And just appreciate everybody and wish you all well, stay safe. And I apologize, I have to drop off.
Thank you, Sheri, for participating. And if anybody has any questions for Sheri specifically, go ahead and chat through the Nature Conservancy and they can link through the questions for Sheri and Chugach. Good luck with your board meeting. Thanks. Tara, would you like to offer your perspective?
Sure. Again, completely support everything that was shared by Anthony. And when you lead with your values, you can't go wrong. And as we look at, you know, again, this ecological sustainability approach, it really should be with a win-win mindset, and how we can all work together, consistent with our values in terms of cooperation, and bringing people of the opposite sort of mindset together to have productive discussions. And what I really value about the Nature Conservancy is their approach for bringing people together to address sort of lightning rod topics in a manner that is solutions oriented and inclusive of diverse opinions. And so moving forward, hosting these types of discussions is valuable for Alaskans in the long run. Thank you.
Equipment failure, sorry. I was on mute a little bit there. I'm going to turn it over to Amber and Ben for their closeout comments, but I did want to just be sure as we're closing out to remind everybody that the next series in the next section of this series is going to be on September 16th at 10:30 Alaska time, and that will be natural climate solutions. So that'll be next week, September 16th, Thursday at 10:30. nature.org/AK climate opportunity. Amber, would you like to offer kind of your perspective on the next 50 years of working with Alaska Natives and Alaska Native corporations?
Yeah, it's thanks for noting that we're coming up on the 50th anniversary of the passage of ANCSA. We're thinking a lot about that in the Senate and in the Indian Affairs Committee, especially after the last few years and some of the misunderstandings about how Alaska is structured. One thing I was thinking about as Anthony was talking in terms of Native values, one goal that I heard recently that really stuck with me is what Val Davidson has articulated for Native health, and that is that Alaska Native people are the healthiest people in the world. So it's good to think about, like, we all have these goals we want to reach, including ANCs, which have incorporated, you know, Native values into their missions. Tribes, of course, and communities are thinking of the long term and sustainability. From the perspective in the Senate, I think what as we consider the next 50 years of ANCSA and success of Alaska Native people, It's ensuring that other members of Congress and in the Senate understand how Alaska is unique, and each program that is developed or tweaked or authorized or reauthorized, we're paying very close attention to the definitions that are used and the ways that whether the ANC should be involved or the tribal government should be involved, or if we should promote or incentivize collaboration with the state or with cities or local governments. We see a lot of success in increased collaboration, including some of the work that Tara launched with Operation Lady Justice, where you have increased collaboration among groups or governments or ANCs that have not previously talked before. You can see really positive changes in those relationships that lead to better policy outcomes. So I think that's what we're thinking of on the Senate side. And of course, if you have other ideas on celebrating ANCSAT 50, you can always reach out and we're happy to talk about that. So thank you very much for pulling this together.
Thanks, Amber. So Ben, you get to wrap up the session today, and I think it's fitting because you represent such a broad and statewide representation of tribes and Alaska Native corporations and some other entities. So how do we approach the next 50 years to meet all of our needs?
That's a big question, and I don't have much else to say. It's a hard act to follow, Tara and Anthony and Amber. But one of the beautiful things about our Alaska community is that we all do work together, right? Our ANCs are a huge opportunity to empowering our 50 years of our future, right? That's our AFN theme this year is, empowering our future. So I think, with our ANCs, the way they have built their capacity, our tribal organizations, TCC, Manita, Coeric, Klina Haida, our tribes, all of us working together is truly a beautiful thing. And with ANCSA account, helps create that, right? Because you all work together, that sharing of that 7I, 7J is such a non-Western thing of sharing our profits with each other. It's really what brings us together, and it's also a unique policy. So for AFN's perspective, I see nothing but opportunities, how we work together to address our unfinished business, such as our food security. And really, today's example of what Tara's talked about, Anthony's talked about, is an example of going forward next 50 years, especially on the policy realm with Murkowski and how we can lift our own voices up. So not much else to follow. Tara's, like I said, Tara's a hard act to follow. So thank you for having me.
Well, we certainly have a lot of resources. One of the topics that I know we're approaching is how do we incorporate our youth? How do we get the younger voice? And I'm hoping that of the 160 folks that are on the Zoom today, many of them are youth from our various communities, because it's going to take all of us to come up with the solutions and the approach to all of these efforts. And we're learning more every day. I want to thank Stephanie Holthouse and the Nature Conservancy for the panel today. I want to thank Andy and Jackson and Rachel Colander for the support today in the panel. And I want to thank everybody who submitted a question in the chat box. If you weren't addressed either in written or in verbal response today, the Nature Conservancy will get back to you. Again, thank you. It's such a great discussion. We hope in the future that we can have some of these in person, but this is a pretty phenomenal way to come together from a diverse geography and diverse backgrounds. And so thank you, everyone. And we'll talk to you all very soon.